Well, hello everyone. We're going to make a start now. So welcome along today. Thank you very much for joining. I'll start with just a very brief introduction, just in case anybody is here who hasn't been along before. So my name is Karen Falconer, and I am the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I'm going to be the presenter today. And I am joined by my colleague, Atim. She's going to be here in the background, just in case anyone should have any technical problems. If you just want to use the side panel there to send her a message, she'll do her best to help you. Of course, hopefully there won't be any. Equally, if you want to use that panel just to send through any messages or questions, then you can do so. But usually we do send out an automated follow-up email just to see if there were any other questions that you wanted to perhaps send through, and they will come through directly to myself, and I'll certainly look to try and get back to as many of you as I possibly can do ASAP. As always, we will be recording this session, so it will be available for you to watch again very shortly if you did just want to go back and reminisce. And equally, if you did want to request a copy of the slides, then please do. More than happy to make those available to anyone who wants it. So today then, we are at stage 5, the final stage for setting up your organisation for compliance. So we're going to have a look at what is a breach, what needs to be documented, how to document any incidents that you might have correctly, and then determine when a breach would actually need to be reported, how you might handle that, and what would happen if you decided not to document or report your breaches, for anyone feeling rebellious. So hopefully then by the end of the session, you'll have an understanding of what is meant by a breach. You know, it's often a term that we roll out without perhaps understanding exactly what it means in this context. Hopefully you'll also be feeling more comfortable with when a breach needs to be reported. You should understand what your obligations are with tracking any breaches that you have on a day-to-day basis, okay? So there is going to be some new initial legwork, but then an ongoing requirement that you'll have to get in the habit of, okay? Hopefully you also know exactly how to report a breach, and importantly then what needs to be included as part of your breach notification, okay? So let's start then. What is a breach? It's good to start out with just some clarity. So in the context of data protection, all right, a breach is any breach of security measures which leads to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or inappropriate use of personal data. Okay, so even if you accidentally hit send on an email and it goes to the wrong person and you didn't mean to do it, that potentially is still a breach, okay? And it is a breach if it leads to destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or inappropriate use of personal data. Okay. So a breach is typically then going to be anything which has already or could result in a form of damage, pretty much. Okay, so some examples below then to put it in real terms. If anything that happened as a result of data processing, you know, that suffered detriment in terms of the measures in place to protect the processing, which resulted in any restriction or compromising of a data subject's rights, okay, that is going to count as a breach. And we're talking about statutory rights here and freedoms, okay? Any loss of control over personal data and its circulation. Okay, so let's say, for example, you had marketing list 1 and it's got thousands of people's contact addresses on there, and you upload an occupational health report to send to Mark, and you accidentally sent that over to marketing list 1, you know, you have lost control over that very sensitive document, which potentially has gone to thousands of people. So you've lost control of the circulation there. Okay, that's going to be an example of a breach. Equally, if any breaches of your measures has or could lead to the data subject concerned being discriminated against, okay, that breach of those measures is going to be something that would count as a breach. If a breach led to any theft from the data subject or fraud of the data subject, so, you know, identity fraud or theft, any financial loss of any kind, really, including, you know, as well, any reputational damage that the data subject might suffer from. These are all going to be examples of breaches, okay? So any of your measures that are breached and could lead to a detriment such as this is going to be a breach, okay? Now, when I talk about breaches of your measures, if you've watched the third part of this series, you'll know that I talked very much about organisational and technological measures. And these are things that you would be putting in place to protect the security of personal data within your organisation. Okay. So if anything were to happen, you know, that conflicted with those measures, that could lead to damage, okay, this is going to be a breach. Now, are you going to have to report every breach to a supervisory authority? The answer is no, actually. So that might be a bit of relief, but you're going to have to be sure that you're getting it right, okay? You are only going to have to actually escalate and report a breach to a supervisory authority if that breach is actually likely, okay, likely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So that last bit is quite technical, you know, the rights and freedoms, but again, we're essentially talking about any of those detriments that I've listed on the previous slide, okay? If it's unlikely that a breach of your measures is going to lead to, you know, anyone being put at a detriment, then no, you're not going to have to report it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of, you know, relief, but nonetheless, it's still going to be very important that we know exactly what to do if it is ever likely or we think it could be likely. Now, what we see here, and you might agree then, that you'll end up essentially with breaches happening in your organisation, because let's face it, they will happen. You know, regardless of your best intention and your best efforts to put measures in place, breaches are probably going to be happening very, very regularly, maybe even daily, okay? But you might agree that you're going to end up with breaches which are reportable and breaches which aren't, okay? Now, privacy professionals distinguish the two by referring to a reportable breach as a breach or a serious breach sometimes. And they refer to those which aren't reportable as incidents. Okay. So for the purpose of distinguishing between the two going forwards, all right, I may talk about breaches, and that's going to be something that's reportable, and incidents, which is still technically a breach, but it's perhaps something that's not reportable. Okay. So in short, just to clarify, an incident is still a breach, but it is going to look more like a lapse, okay, or a weakness in your security measures that you've put in place to protect personal data. Okay, so an example of an incident could be something like leaving a secure door open, but actually otherwise, as a result of that door being left open, personal data was not breached in a way which was likely to result in a detriment to the subject. So for example, You might have a security door which is deliberately made heavy, so it always closes behind itself and needs, a key to get into it. If somebody were to leave that open, but actually has otherwise left a tidy desk with everything locked away, perhaps other colleagues are in that secure area as well, and there are no visitors on site, for example, yes, that secure door might have been a security measure that you've put in place, but actually as a result of that lapse, okay, it's not actually really going to lead to any harm to anyone, no harm done, okay, so it might be an incident. It's a breach of your measures, but it's not going to lead to any serious issues. So other examples then might be things like, leaving a confidential document in the wrong sort of bin. You put it in the bin at your desk rather than a shredder or a confidential waste bin. Maybe leaving a computer screen unlocked is one as well, or leaving your computer unattended. It's very much going to depend on your organisation, what you do on a day-to-day basis, maybe even what individuals in your organisation do on a day-to-day basis. It's very likely that some people in your business are going to be dealing with, much more sensitive or much greater levels of personal data than the next person. So actually, for one person, it could be incredibly important to ensure they've always locked away documentation they're working on, and the next person, it might not be so important. For example, perhaps a branch manager working in a shop, might walk away from their computer screen in their office, but actually all the information they have on that computer is things like sales targets and takings, okay? Perhaps not any personal data on that computer, so it's not imperative for you to have, a measure of locking your screen when you walk away. But for other organisations who are dealing with highly sensitive or again, a lot of personal data on a regular basis, like a HR manager, it might be very important, to have a measure such as locking your screen whenever you leave your desk. So, it's going to require you to look at your organisation as a whole, what's important to us, maybe even what jobs are doing what, and what measures you're going to invoke. Okay, but again, any minor lapse may be an incident, and any more major lapse is likely to result in damage to a personal or to personal data for a data subject is going to be a breach. Okay. So yeah, you'll need to consider what's important to you and where that might happen. And it's not necessarily going to be the same, thing in every organisation. So it is going to take a bit of head scratching, I'm afraid, and going to a drawing board, perhaps with your other senior management team to consider. So what does the GDPR require us to document in respect of breaches? Well, if any of you cared to pick up the regulation, and I'm not expecting you to, hence why I've done it for you, if you wanted to flip to the 33rd section, Article 33, which is all about notification of a personal data breach, it says in there that the data controller shall document any breach of security for personal data. So that's really quite broad, okay? I said on the previous slide, okay, that this is anything which has or could result in a form of damage. Okay, so basically, a data controller, and every employer is going to be a data controller, okay? So every employer, let's say, is going to have to be documenting every breach that happens in their organisation, which has or could result in a form of damage to a personal, to a data subject. Okay, so this is really broad, and the reason for that is because the GDPR really does seek to make organisations accountable. It's the primary overarching principle of the regulation. Okay, and where there is starting to become more and more hype, even though we're fast approaching the 25th of May when it's enforceable, you know, there's a lot of concern about, you know, the new rules and, you know, the stringent approach that's being taken here. But a lot of the reason for that is so that we can self-regulate. You know, we're not actually going to have to be registering with the ICO. We're not going to have to be reporting nearly as much as we used to have to do previously to them. But that essentially is on the condition that we are self-regulating. We are documenting what we do ourselves internally, and that includes being on top of any breaches that are happening inside our organization. Okay, so that's essentially why we're being asked to document any breach that happens. Okay, so what I'm going to look at now is how we should be doing that correctly. Okay, because if we did have a breach that needed to be notified to the ICO, if all of your key business decisions happen in the UK, then they would want to be able to come in and see this document, and you know, that essentially is going to prove that we know what we're supposed to be doing. We are capable of regulating ourselves. We don't need you to then, you know, be breathing down our necks, you know, forevermore. We're abreast of what we should be doing, but we've just had to notify you of this particular, you know, more serious breach. Okay. So how should we be documenting incidents? Okay, and I'm looking at incidents specifically because we'll see later on that breaches are probably going to need to have a much quicker turnaround. Okay, so you're probably going to need something a bit more instant to escalate breaches. But let's have a look at incidents then. So if we've got to keep abreast of any breach to personal data, okay, this is not a one-man job. You're going to need all of your staff, at least, okay, maybe even anyone who has regular interaction with your organization. So I'm thinking about third parties or self-employed individuals here. You're going to need everybody, okay, to help with this, because I'm telling you now, they will probably all be witnessing breaches, okay, which could count as an incident on a daily basis, because it's just human nature to make mistakes, okay? So I would strongly advise you to go away and set up some sort of log, okay? The regulation is very clear that when we're documenting any breaches, that documentation needs to cover off A, the facts relating to that breach, B, the effects of that breach, and C, any steps that you may have taken to remedy the effects of that breach, okay? And this might include the likelihood of its reoccurrence. So this log, all right, could perhaps take the form of, say, a spreadsheet that's perhaps in a centralized location. It might be a questionnaire if you're quite savvy with setting things like that up on, say, some sort of internal intranet system, okay? Or it might even be something as simple as an email template that you send out to all staff and say to them, you know, if you witness something that could be an incident, okay, or a lapse in our security measures for personal data, please fill in this email template and send it off to Joe Blogs, okay? It also means you need to get Joe Blogs on form with on side with collating these emails, but you see where I'm going. Okay, so this is going to be really important that it's clear to use. Okay, it prompts them themselves to put in the facts. It prompts them to consider the effects. And in terms of steps that might be taken, you know, on an individual level, that person might have already been able to do something without telling management even, you know, like trying to recall an email, for example. But essentially, it's probably going to be well worth setting up a team, or if it's something you're doing by yourself, arranging perhaps, say, quarterly or more frequently than that if you think it's necessary, to review this log, because you're probably just realistically not going to be able to review it on a daily basis by any means, probably not even weekly. But review this log and see if you can pick up or identify any trends. Okay, so we spoke in our third webinar about risks and reviewing risks. Okay, if you review a log of incidents that are happening, this is going to be a great way of finding out what risks are happening, and it may even be something that actually you can mirror or link into your continual assessment of risks that might be occurring within your data processes. Okay. But certainly, I think it's going to be extremely good practice to review these on a regular basis. Any lapses that are happening regularly are going to be, a bit embarrassing, really. Let's say that one of those eventually led to an actual breach. You had to report that to the ICO. They ask to come in and see your documenting of incidents and breaches, and they can see that there has been a pattern of this same incident happening week in, week out in your organization, and you didn't do anything about it. That's going to be difficult to explain away. They're not going to take a very kind view to that, so if you are in the habit of reviewing these things and actually proactively thinking, well, how can I try and stop that from happening so regularly, because it does seem to be happening all the time, it's going to come back and bite me one day, that is going to be an excellent way of demonstrating that you've taken steps to remedy the effects and likelihoods of these incidents reoccurring or even becoming breaches. Okay, so let's have a little bit more of a look at what sort of thing this log is going to cover and what it's going to look like. Okay, so I've sort of mentioned before, but this really should be something that's accessible to all staff. Okay, once you've set it up, it's no good at existing without anybody knowing about it. So you're going to have to arrange for some sort of communication to go out, pointing everyone to its location and explaining the purpose of it to everybody. There's no better way of encouraging people to do something you've asked them to do than if you explain the reason why. So be transparent about it. Why not? The whole regulation is about transparency. And equally, it's going to be much more difficult for them to explain away why they haven't reported something, if something came back to bite in the future. If you've told them exactly why they need to be doing this. So tell them why we're doing it. Consider how you can encourage regular, if not daily, use of this log, because I think what's inevitably going to happen is the concern that by completing this log, okay, they could be, in inverted commas, dobbing themselves in, or snitching on their other colleagues, and they're probably not going to want to do that, are they? But if it's not happening, you aren't going to be aware of all the incidents that are going on. And equally, let's say you did have a breach, ICO knock on your door and say, can I have a look at your incident log, please? You open it up and you've got nothing on there. I just don't think they're going to believe that you've never had an incident or lapse in your measures that you've put in place, especially when measures can be something so simple as, a lock on a cabinet door. As nobody ever left that key in that door, really, so we've got to get people using this. So spend a little bit of time, when you're creating this, thinking about how you can reassure everybody, that your expectations are that it is completed, that people are open and honest. perhaps reassure them by telling them what you're going to do with the information once you've collected it, so it's not perhaps going to be the case, that if somebody puts their name on there or their colleague's name, that's it. You're going to be marched into a disciplinary hearing. Good luck to you. It's actually more likely that you won't hear back about it. We want to see what's going on so that we can put things in place to support you more, or to remedy anything that's happening on a regular basis. Of course, you might have to take formal action against somebody who's negligent or really deliberately, breached your security measures. But for things that are just happening down to human error, which really haven't led to anything serious, this is just something you want to be aware of so you can understand how data is at risk in your business. So just preempt concerns that people are going to have over this, possible blame culture that they're likely to instantly jump to, when they see an email out saying we've got to put everything that we do wrong in this log, and see if there's anything that you can do to address that. I've spoken previously about how there are all sorts of tools available online, and many of them are for free actually, which can help to promote awareness internally, like posters that you might put up near printers, or even postcards, which can be quite crude perhaps, but can actually start to become quite fun, especially if you let staff use them against senior managers as well. So for example, you can download postcards which say what's missing, and it might be that if somebody stepped away from their desk and left their work phone there, or a sensitive document like a sick note or something, you might take it, look after it yourself, of course, but leave that postcard in place so that when they come back from the loo, poor person, they think, oh my God, what have I done? Who's got it? And it is a bit daft, but it can start to become a bit more fun rather than, negative and all about blame and, pointing fingers. So just, consider if there's anything like that, as crude as it might be, just to start prompting people to think about what they're actually doing. It's easy to preach at people, isn't it? But actually trying to get them physically involved can really help with the way that they perceive things and think about it. Now, as part of this incident log, it's probably going to be really quite worthwhile that you include something that might prompt your staff to think, is this incident that I'm reporting actually a breach? Because it would be awful if, they were doing the right thing and they were being upfront and filling in this log, and they filled it in with something that was a breach and you didn't know about it until X number of weeks, months later, when you come to do your routine review of the log and you think, oh my goodness, I've fallen foul of the requirements on me to report a breach or a serious breach. Okay, so perhaps include in there something that says to them, is this incident likely to result in any detriment to the data subject? And if in doubt, tick yes, so that at least you can come along and determine for yourself whether or not it is something that constitutes a breach that's reportable. So when does a breach need to be reported? It needs to be reported, as I've said before then, if it is likely to result in a risk to the data subject. And it also needs to be reported if you've not been able to take any subsequent remedial action. Okay, so this is after the fact. If there has been a breach, but you have been able to very quickly put in place something that actually means it's no longer likely to result in a risk, then you wouldn't have had to report that breach. Okay, but if you haven't been able to put anything in place that removes that likelihood, then you are in a position where you think, right, I need to get reporting this breach and notifying the supervisory authority. Now, just a quick tip here. you might be very au fait with encryption, or you might have heard the word before but not fully understand what it means. It's not as simple as putting a password on something. But if you have something like a portable device, okay, and you've encrypted the hardware, the hard drive on it, okay, or perhaps you've sent an email or a document and you've used encryption to send it off, okay, and let's say that loses its way or is accidentally lost or even stolen, okay, then because that item has been encrypted, the GDPR actually says that is not a reportable breach. Okay, so there's some good news. Okay, something you can do straight away, perhaps, to minimize risks. Okay, so if you're not 100% clear on what encryption is, or you don't really know how to go about doing it, contact a specialist in IT or information security. Okay, and if you can afford it, get encryption in place. All right, the GDPR does talk about getting in place state-of-the-art equipment and processes wherever possible. Again, something we've mentioned before when we were talking in our third webinar about privacy by design and impact assessments. Okay, we are expected to put in place any state-of-the-art equipment we can where appropriate. So have a look at encryption, okay, because straight away, hopefully that's going to be one less headache for you, one less thing to worry about. So if you did meet those two criteria and you think, right, how do I notify the supervisory authorities about this? What do you need to do? Well, firstly, and probably the most important thing to be aware of, all right, is that if this is actually a breach rather than an incident, you have only got 72 hours from awareness of the breach to get it notified to the authorities. Okay, so 72 hours from awareness. And this is why it is going to be no good if you get something which is actually a breach on your incident log and you don't pick it up for weeks or months, okay, because you ought to have got it reported within this 72 hours, okay. It is a really tight turnaround. Again, it's just indicative of this requirement for us all to be so much more accountable, so much more in control of our personal data and our processes. Because actually, if we are audited, if we do know who's responsible for what, and if we have got security measures in place and things that let us know when they've been compromised, and we are informing our staff and others, other third parties to tell us about when something that might be more than just an incident has happened, we should be well equipped to inform them within 72 hours, in theory. It might not be something that many of us feel we're equipped to do in the near future, and I can understand that, but nonetheless, from the 25th of May, that is how long we are going to have to notify, okay? You've got to notify your relevant supervisory authority. And again, to reiterate, if all of your key business decisions are made in the UK, okay, then your relevant supervisory authority is the Information Commissioner's Office. Okay, it is the ICO. If your key business decisions are actually made in another EU member state and you are in the UK as a satellite office or another base, okay, then you will need to find out who the supervisory authority is in that other EU member state, okay? So if your head office, let's say, is in Holland, you need to find out the contact details of the Dutch authority, all right? We do have what would you call it? Well, we've got a directory. There you go. We've got a directory available. You can find them online fairly easily as well. But if you did want to know who that is, please just get in touch and let us know. And how you actually report to them is not something that they've really communicated until very recently, but their website has been updated to essentially say that any way in which you can get in touch with us is going to be acceptable. All right, so maybe get their phone number on speed dial. They do have a free phone number, okay? Of course, you may want to contact them by letter, but probably in this day and age, we're looking at emails, secure emails, of course. And, you will need to be sending off a certain amount of detail, which we're going to have a look at now. Okay, so as part of your notification that you make in 72 hours, you will need to include all of the following information. Okay. So there are 8 things, but what's nice about it is that it is a quite neat, tidy and prescribed list. So it is one of the few areas of the regulation where they do hand it to us on a plate, fortunately. So we would need to describe, firstly, the nature of the breach. Okay, so a detailed but succinct description of what's actually happened. Okay. You would then need to cover off the number of data subjects concerned. Okay, so the data subjects are, probably going to be your employees, could be candidates, could be ex-employees, could be workers, could be self-employed contractors, and going outside employment law, it could be your customers, your clients, service users, and so on. Okay, so how many data subjects are involved? Now, if you can't give a precise number, you should try and give an approximate number as close, to the ballpark as possible. You would need to include the categories of the data, okay? So this is things like, is it addresses that have been compromised? Is it phone numbers that have been compromised? Is it names? Is it email addresses? What categories of personal data have been compromised? And the categories of data subjects, so I listed them before, employees, candidates, ex-employees, and so on. Okay, so you're giving the number of people affected and what categories they are broken down into. And then you would also have to give an approximate number of the actual records concerned. Okay, so we've said that it could be addresses, okay, that are compromised. How many addresses are compromised, as far as you can reasonably tell? Next up, contact details. Stands to reason, if you're going to notify them that there's been a potential breach, they're of course going to want to get in touch with you and find out a little bit more about what's going on. So you would need to include the contact details of somebody who's going to be responsible for speaking with a member of the ICO or whoever it might be. Now, this could be your data protection officer if you had to appoint one. If you've chosen to appoint somebody in a similar position, like a data protection manager or a compliance manager, you might give their details. You might give the details of the data controller. Okay, so perhaps the managing director or somebody like that. You would then have to describe the likely consequences of the breach. Okay, and that's all right, because actually you're probably aware of that already. Bearing in mind, you would know that you're only notifying them of a breach because it's likely to compromise or put at detriment the data subject. You've already worked out, what that compromise is. So here we've listed all the details of the personal data that's compromised, who's affected, and then you're going to describe why essentially you feel that this is a breach rather than an incident. And then lastly, if you've had time, any measures that you might have already put in place to address this breach, okay? Now remember that if you were able to put some measures in place after you found out about the breach, which meant it's no longer likely that you're compromising the data subject's rights or putting them at risk of any damage or detriment, then you won't have to be notifying the ICO or whoever it might be in the first place. Okay, so this is only if you've been able to put something in place to try and limit that damage, but you've still felt that it's still likely that there are some risks there. Okay. So this is quite a neat and tidy list, and it is something that you may feel that you're able to turn into a form, okay? It's certainly something that we've done, so if you do have access to our knowledge base or you wish to subscribe to it, you know, there's a wealth of documentation on there that gets you pre-prepared for compliance, and this is going to be one of the things that you can find on there, okay? And again, given that tight turnaround, why not be prepared for one now, you know, rather than being aware of breach and then scrabbling around for, you know, everything that you knew you had to include in the notification. You know, have your form there ready to go. So it's one less thing you have to think about in that quick turnaround. So that's essentially it, okay? You know, the difference between something that's reportable and not, how you're going to go about tracking that, and what you actually need to do if it is a breach that's likely to result in a detriment to the data subject, okay? So what happens if you don't report a breach? You know, if you don't track breaches and incidents, how can you be aware of it if you don't track it? You know, are you going to fall foul of anything there? I'm afraid you are, yes. There's a couple of articles in there which are very clear about this towards the back end, where it all gets very legal in terms of ramifications. But for us, you know, on a day-to-day basis, without getting into the nitty-gritty of how our supervisory authorities and Mr. and Mrs. Justice can penalise us in tribunal, the ICO have been very clear, thankfully, that they far prefer transparency as an approach, okay, which is great. Actually, it's akin to the whole point of the regulation. Transparency is one of the 6 key principles. They would far rather that you contacted them and said, look, we are documenting incidents, we think we've got something that counts as a breach, can you have a look at this information and let us know if you do think it counts? They would far rather tell you that it isn't one than you sit on it and it was one, okay? And if you do tell them and it is a breach, they've again been very clear that their intention is going to be to try and support organisations with, you know, putting any further remedies or measures in place that they can do, again, just to restrict the damage further. And to try and stop it from happening again. But they do have powers, you know, to take remedial action against you. If you have, you know, just been paying lip service, if you've ignored this, or if you haven't put anything in place regardless, you know, of your awareness, it's just not going to cut it. And as in any legal circumstance, ignorance is not going to be a defence, you know. So again, as I've suggested, you try and set up in your organisation a culture of transparency and reporting internally, please do try and go forward with a culture of transparency for reporting with the Information Commissioner, okay? They can impose administrative fines for non-compliance. And if anyone thought, you know, well, if I'm not aware, how can I be penalised for not reporting something I wasn't aware of? Failing to put measures in place to document incidents that are happening is going to be viewed as non-compliance. Okay, so if you decide not to set up a log, that is non-compliance and you could be penalised for that. Okay, so every which way you look at it, this is something we are going to have to do, and it's why I have included it as a 5th and key step for compliance in preparation for GDPR. Okay. So that is pretty much it, okay? Now, there may be circumstances where you have to let a data subject know as well, okay? It's very rare that this is ever going to be the case, okay? But if you did end up in that situation, the ICO will look to support you in communicating that breach, okay? And it is, again, something you would have to do very, very promptly. Oddly, it's not something you would have to do for every breach, but you may need to. And so I am going to leave it up to them to tell you as and when you ought to be doing that. Again, to encourage this need for transparency. But that is all I really wanted to cover off for you today in respect of breaches, okay? If you do have any questions that I haven't answered as we've gone through, please do pop them over to me. We usually send out an automated email to just remind you that you attended. So again, that's another prompt to send your questions over to me directly. And wherever possible, you know, I will try and get back to you eventually, and I will try and do it as soon as I possibly can to help you with getting set up. That's it. That is our 5 stages. There are other things, you know, that are important, I'm afraid, that you do need to be doing. But certainly in terms of setting up and organising all your internal processes so that you can feel comfortable that going forwards you're ready for GDPR, you know, this is what you need to do. We've done some complimentary webinars as well on topics like subject access requests. Please do have a look at that if you haven't already. We may certainly look to do things on things like privacy statements, because you do need to communicate certain things to data subjects whenever you process personal data, you know, and there are some statutory rights and things like that that are coming in, like the right to be forgotten. So if you have any questions of any of that, please do let me know, but do watch this space in case we do look to put up any further webinars if we have demand for it. So there we are. We've got some really exciting and juicy employment law seminars coming up. So if you fancy coming along, meeting us in person and having a chat about things that are actually HR and employment law, if you're a bit fed up of data protection now, come along. There's only a small fee, essentially, for the use of the buildings we're holding it at, but it'd be great to have as many people there as we can. We do like to talk, as you can probably tell from the way I like to go on. So thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful. We are at the end of our session now, and good luck as you try and get compliant. Take care, and maybe see you again for another webinar soon. All the best.